Hello, I'm Charlie, and this is my history special project presentation on Kaiser Wilhelm II and 19th century conceptions of health. In this presentation, I will address 19th century conceptions of the psychic and the somatic, the role of masculinity in health, and theories of degeneration, and how all these affected perceptions of Kaiser Wilhelm II throughout his life and reign. During the presentation, I will utilize some medical vocabulary that may be unfamiliar to you. I have included a full definition of terms on the handout, so that I will not have to take up unnecessary time defining terms. It is impossible to address this topic without some cursory background of the Kaiser's medical history. Unlike in typical births, when the baby emerges from the birth canal head first, Wilhelm was born feet first, and what is referred to medically as a traumatic breech birth. In order to successfully extricate Wilhelm from his mother's womb, the doctor had to forcefully twist his left arm from behind his head, damaging the brachial plexus, the bundle of nerves in the neck responsible for controlling the muscles of the arm, shoulder, and hand. As a result of this forceful handling, Wilhelm would never have full use of his left arm throughout his life. The further implications of his traumatic breech birth are even more important to this presentation. The danger of traumatic breech births is that as the head, the area of anatomy of an infant that has the greatest diameter, enters the birth canal, the umbilical cord is pressed up against the vaginal wall, cutting off the oxygen supply to the infant's brain. Furthermore, the use of chloroform as an anesthetic for Wilhelm's mother, Victoria, during the birth would have further worsened any fetal asphyxia sustained, as chloroform is now understood to reduce blood pressure and organ function, including that of the lungs. It has been theorized by medical historians that Wilhelm was hypoxic for nearly 10 minutes during his birth, more than sufficient time to cause minimal perinatal brain damage. Though children with such birth complications are no less intelligent than other children, they are very often hyperactive, sensitive to light and sound, have shortened attention spans, and exhibit mild psychopathic disturbances, meaning an impaired sense of empathy, lack of impulse control, and egotistical behavior. Wilhelm's own personality traits, which were so denounced by his family and politicians alike, cannot be understood without this background information. The trauma Wilhelm had suffered during his birth can certainly explain the development of many of his personality traits. Even casual observers could observe that Wilhelm was undoubtedly hyperactive well into adulthood. Following a lunch with Wilhelm in the summer of 1891, the English Viscount John Morley noted, "I was immensely interested in watching a man with such a part to play in Europe. Energy, rapidity, restlessness, and every movement, from his short, quick inclinations of the head to the planting of the foot. But I should be disposed to doubt whether it is all sound, steady, and the result of what Herbert Spencer would call rightfully coordinated organization." Wilhelm's capricious and unpredictable behavior would often manifest itself in the form of pranks that had the unfortunate tendency of nearly causing international incidents. One such example was when Wilhelm nearly caused an international incident by grabbing the behind of the King of Bulgaria. If Wilhelm ever felt underappreciated, he could respond with either an explosive temper or icy, passive-aggressive resentment. Wilhelm's lack of psychological consistency led him to be dependent upon external emotional validation. Politically, this means that he often ended up agreeing with whomever he spoke to last. His close friend, Prince Philip zu Eulenburg, noted that Wilhelm had a feminine tendency to wish to please. One of Eulenburg's nicknames for Wilhelm was Wilhelm Proteus, after the mythical Greek prophet who could assume any shape he wished. Now we will move on to the 19th century conceptions of physical and mental health. In the 19th century, mental and physical health were viewed to be interdependent of one another, and that good health was indicative of sound moral character as well. 19th century medical treatises firmly placed the well-being of the mind in direct correlation with the well-being of the body. The most important British work on this topic from the first half of the 19th century was James Cowell Pritchard's Treatise on Insanity and Other Disorders Affecting the Mind. Published in 1835, Pritchard firmly dismissed any notion that madness was caused by an idiopathic disease of the mind, meaning that it was without secondary or predisposing diseases of the body. So for decades, doctors continued to seek physiological explanations and cures for mental neuroses. The British psychiatrist Henry Maudsley wrote in his 1871 work, Body and Mind, that we must recognize how entirely the integrity of the mental functions depend on the integrity of the bodily organization. Wilhelm's injured arm likely added to the views that he was neurologically unsound. Throughout his reign, he suffered a number of nervous breakdowns that usually coincided with a number of scandals that significantly affected his popularity. The influence of the nervous system on the well-being of both the mind and the body had been assumed by physicians since the 18th century. When 19th century physicians referred to diseases of the nervous system, they could equally mean psychic or somatic ailments. Wilhelm's mother is widely agreed to have had a distinctly negative view of her son's disability, believing that it would be a hindrance to his character. 19th century conceptions of health, especially male health, placed a great emphasis upon physical wholeness and athletic ability. Victoria felt that her son would never be able to be independent and manly like other boys, as he would never be able to do anything in the way of amusement or bodily exercise that they can. Participation in physical activity such as sports was seen as vital to developing the good character of a young man. The Victorian idealization of the athletic male figure could have further affected contemporary views of Wilhelm. Great emphasis was placed upon symmetrical development of the body, posited on the important relationship between form and function. Asymmetrical form of the body was seen as inimical to health and even detrimental to the mind. It is no wonder that Wilhelm's family focused so much upon the unbalance of his bodily development. As a small child, Wilhelm had to undergo a number of surgeries to correct his posture by severing some tendons in his functional shoulder, as the underdevelopment of his left shoulder was causing crookedness of his bearing. Wilhelm underwent further treatments for his arm that, in this day and age, would be nothing short of child abuse. As his crippled arm did not allow him to crawl like other small children, his good arm was bound to his torso in the expectation that he would adapt and skip straight to walking. He was also forced to wear a brace that was designed to stretch the muscles of his dominant shoulder in the hope that it would correct his crooked posture. Undoubtedly, this all created in Wilhelm a deep sense of inferiority that persisted throughout his adolescence. When Wilhelm became engaged to Princess Augusta Victoria of Schleswig-Holstein, he had expressed to his old tutor, George Hinspeter, that he had never thought it possible that a lady could ever take any real interest in him on account of his arm. Small wonder, as his mother had confessed to frequently telling him as a child that no lady would ever have him because of his black finger. Modern psychological studies have shown that children with disabilities often suffer from emotional problems, stemming from perceptions that, at worst, they are a freak or oddity, and at best, to have something wrong with them, which implicitly implies some amount of guilt or blame on the part of the child. These feelings of guilt and shame are very often shared by the child's parents. Wilhelm's disability significantly colored the way his close family regarded him. Hinspeter ascribed Wilhelm's constant need to impress others through appearances to his overhearing his uncle, Prince Karl Friedrich, say that a one-armed man could never be the king of Prussia. Prussian society was already overtly favored towards masculine and militaristic qualities of discipline, toughness, and soldierly adherence to duty. As Wilhelm's disability precluded him from ever fully taking part in military service, he must have seemed unfit for the office his birth had granted him. The implicit meaning of male health in the 19th century was oriented towards capability of manual labor or military service. Furthermore, conceptions of male health did not look kindly upon those with physical limitations, which I will now address. In the 19th century, a man was only seen as whole as his body was. Victorian medical texts refer to amputees in distinctly gendered terms, and loss of limb was seen to be accompanied by a proportionate loss of gender. Loss of limb unmanned amputees, and Henry Maudsley declared that the forms and habits of mutilated men approached those of women. The stumps of amputees were observed to manifest distinctly feminine traits, such as suffering from convulsions and spasms and chronic pain, sharing such symptoms that were commonly found in females, more particularly those of the hysterical temperament. Though Wilhelm was not a traditional amputee, the loss of ability of his limb similarly handicapped him as if the arm had been removed, which he then strove to compensate for the rest of his life with his soldierly and ultra-masculine behavior. Wilhelm's love of militarism and masculine company would be a continuous trend throughout his life, and it is generally accepted that his disability played a significant part in his hyper-masculine posturing. As Emil Ludwig argued in his 1926 biography of Wilhelm, the first of many to be published, this hourly, lifelong effort to conceal a congenital, in no way repulsive stigma of nature was the decisive factor in the development of his character. The weakling sought to emphasize his strength, but instead of doing so intelligently, as his lively intelligence would have permitted, tradition and vainglory urged him to the exhibition of a heroic, that is to say, soldierly personality. No theory of mental disease enjoyed as much popularity in the 19th century as the theory of mental degeneracy. During the 19th century, two notions of heredity existed. The first was the aristocratic, meaning for identifying legitimate noble bloodlines, the other, the medical, for carrying hereditary traits. According to this theory, families afflicted with degeneracy suffered a measured but not irreversible hereditary deterioration, noticeable over the generations. Families that exhibited signs of degeneration displayed symptoms such as moral depravity, mania, and feeble-mindedness. Degeneracy could be caused by a number of factors, including alcoholism, immorality, and poor diet, but the principal cause of degeneracy was always seen as hereditary genetics. Degeneracy theory had first been formulated in the 1850s and enjoyed its peak of popularity in the 1880s and 1890s, with its popularity subsequently decreasing after the 1900s. Between the 1860s and 1880s, hereditarianism gained considerable popularity within mental medicine. In 1886, a French doctor named Jules Christian stated that with the ideas that reign in pathology today, doctors were likely to cite heredity as the almost sole efficient cause of mental alienation. This intellectual trend in psychiatry would become more important in speculative diagnoses of Wilhelm during and after the First World War. The first speculative diagnosis of Wilhelm came during the First World War, in Augustin Cabannet's Folie du Empereur. Published in 1915, it passed judgment not only on Wilhelm, but the whole Hohenzollern bloodline as a dynasty of degenerates. The emphasis of heredity in Cabannet's work reflects the common-held belief that mental and physical abnormalities were symptomatic of degenerative genetics, implying that Wilhelm was not only physically and mentally maimed, but also morally degenerate. Wilhelm was portrayed as the culmination of the worst traits of previous Hohenzollern rulers. Cabane cited Wilhelm as possessing the brutality of the Soldier King, Frederick William I, the immorality of Frederick the Great, who was notorious as a homosexual, and the hazy brain of Frederick William IV, who had suffered a stroke in his later years. In 1904, in an article of the North American Review, a doctor noted that it is not difficult to find a distinct insane trace, which in times more remote found expression in cruelty, oppression, and unmistakable insanity of other kinds, or in recent times, by a mental degeneration, which is strikingly exemplified in the present German sovereign. The author of this work, Alan Hamilton, went on to expand upon this in another essay in the North American Review, which was published during the First World War. In this second essay, he maintained that Wilhelm had exhibited numerous psychopathic traits in his youth and childhood, and that his early adulthood was punctuated by instances of insane behavior, which had since become more conspicuous and continuous. Throughout Wilhelm's life, his contemporaries frequently expressed the belief that he was not mentally sound. Wilhelm the Sudden, as he was nicknamed, was viewed as impulsive, unbalanced, narcissistic, and convoluted in his psychological profile. His love of bombastic speeches, elaborate costumes, his ferocious temper, and unpredictability caused him to be perceived as at best eccentric and at worst insane by his contemporaries. Wilhelm was, as Sir Edward Grey, the British foreign minister, would put, a battleship with steam up and screws going, but with no rudder. He would run into something one day and cause a catastrophe. Following an 1896 speech of Wilhelm's, in which he characterized the revered Otto von Bismarck and Helmut von Moltke as lackeys and pygmies, Count Anton Mons, the Prussian minister to Bavaria, wrote, "Our friends are dismayed by the Kaiser. Their resentment goes deeper than ever before. Many are saying secretly that His Majesty is insane. Already there are hints to this effect in the press. It is as if from time to time the man were seized by an evil spirit, benighting his mind and compelling him to make speeches which insult the nation to the quick." Views that the Kaiser was not mentally sound were not limited to German circles. The British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury frequently expressed his belief that Wilhelm was not all there. These beliefs that Wilhelm was mentally ill would find new expressions after the First World War, as the combatant nations struggled to find somewhere to lay the blame for the destruction. Attempts by psychiatrists and physicians to diagnose the Kaiser abounded in Germany after the First World War. In 1919, Adolf Friedlander published Wilhelm II, Versuch einer psychologischen Analyse, and like Cabanes, found Wilhelm exhibiting all indications of overbreeding and degeneration. Another work, also published in 1919 by Paul Tesdorf, attempted to exonerate German guilt for the war by laying the blame squarely upon Wilhelm. I quote, "The government of Wilhelm II was spurious. It had to collapse. What was to blame for the spuriousness? Was it his will? His will perhaps was noble and pure, but he was sick, as were his thoughts and emotions. For the experienced physician and psychiatrist, there can be no doubt that Wilhelm II, already as a youth, was mentally ill. The blame for the war which can be attributed to him was the result of this illness." Thomas Kohut is one modern scholar who views these attempts to diagnose the Kaiser as a way to grant the defeated German nation a national alibi in the wake of the 1919 peace. The German nation could be absolved of the blame in its defeat, and instead blame placed upon Wilhelm the cripple and the psychopath. An epistemological problem with medicine is that while illnesses can be identified, classified, and treated, health itself remains an elusive concept. Throughout the history of medicine, health was imagined not only as the absence of illness, but also as an ideal that had yet to be achieved. If Germany's leader had been mentally unbalanced, how would a mentally stable leader have dealt with the First World War? The belief that Wilhelm's weak nerves had lost the war for Germany were expounded in Ernst Müller's 1927 Historical and Psychiatric Study of Wilhelm and the Hohenzollerns. Whereas previous German studies had been framed in the context of deflecting the war guilt clause of the Treaty of Versailles, Müller was far more concerned with why Germany had lost the war at all. It implicitly made Wilhelm the most prominent of those weak-willed soldiers who had suffered mental breakdown in the face of the horrors of modern industrialized war. Wilhelm's failure necessitated new leadership of Germany. The degeneration of the Hohenzollerns that had led Germany to catastrophe had wider implications, argued Müller. The degenerated aristocracy of the imperial past would have to be replaced with a new cadre of leadership, defined by biology and eugenics. Germany's future leaders would be men with blonde hair, slender heads, blue eyes, of good intellect, of noble sentiment, of lean build, self-confidence, and restraint and elegant gait. The 19th century theories of mental and physical health, ability, and infirmity, which had been used to castigate Wilhelm during his life and reign, would have far more tragic implications in the decades to come.